my friend and fellow freedom fighter, Christina Sandefur.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thanks to all of you for coming out. I want to thank you for inviting me for a couple of reasons. One, I'm coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona, which is probably the only place in the country where when we travel to New Mexico, we say, oh my gosh, it's so cool here. I got in a little earlier. I actually went for a walk. People were looking at me like I was crazy, and I thought, you can't do this at home. It's still 100 degrees. So thank you for that. Also, did not coordinate this on purpose, but when I landed, my nail polish actually matched everything in your airport. It's lovely to be among friends here in New Mexico. I am so happy to be supporting the Federalist Society here. I'm actually a board member of the Phoenix Federalist Society. We have an event going on tonight. It's our annual United States Supreme Court preview event, and I told them that this event was going to be so much better, primarily because of the speaker, but also because of the audience. But I actually took a picture over in the corner to show them how many people came out for this event, because I bet we're going to beat the Phoenix crowd tonight. And I'm going to show them that New Mexico knows how to bring people into a room to talk about property rights. So very exciting to be here for that. And also, of course, thanks to our friends at AFP. The Goldwater Institute works with AFP in Arizona and across the country. We appreciate their leadership. And if you are not going to give your hard-earned money to support the Goldwater Institute, the second best organization that you could give your money to is the Rio Grande Foundation. These guys are just doing amazing work here. It's not lost upon me that in Arizona, although we have a lot of challenges, we also have a much easier terrain to work in than you all do. And so you're so fortunate to have guys like Paul working here on behalf of you, fighting for your freedom every single day. So please support them. That said, today I'm going to talk a little bit about private property rights. Now, I had planned to bring books for all of you. Cornerstone of Liberty is actually the title of a book that I co-authored with my husband a few years ago. He is also a freedom fighting attorney. And so it's a family business. Those who sue together stay together. But unfortunately, the publisher messed up and didn't get them here in time. So there are cards on the table over there that say complimentary membership in the Goldwater Institute. If you fill those out, and you'll notice the complimentary, all you need to do is put your name and address, and note that you were here at this event. I will actually mail you one of the books if you'd like to read it. Now, you may want to wait until after the talk to do that, because if you don't like what I have to say, I'm pretty sure you're not going to like the book, and then you'll even bother. All right, so let's talk a little bit about private property rights. When I speak to groups about private property rights, a lot of times people just kind of scratch their heads when it's outside of a group that is already very immersed in these types of topics, because they say, well, property rights, it's so irrelevant. That's something like you study in school. That's something that's, we talk about maybe in the history of the founding of the country, but like today, that's just a tool of the wealthy. That's just, property rights are for rich people. They're not for everyday Americans. And they forget just how important property rights are. And so one of the things that we're trying to do at the Goldwater Institute is use modern examples to kind of get people excited about property rights again. One of the issues we've been focusing on a lot recently is home sharing, short-term rentals, right? The ability to allow people to stay overnight in your home for money for a couple of days if they're here visiting for vacation or for business or that sort of thing. Now, there was a man in Arizona named Glenn Odegaard, and he's from my area of Arizona, the Phoenix area, and he had been traveling up into the mountains into a little town named Jerome, Arizona. Has anyone here been to Jerome, Arizona? Wow, this is probably the most I've ever had. There's always one though. I swear, no matter where I am, there's always somebody that's been to Jerome, Arizona. It tickles me. But Jerome, Arizona, for those of you who haven't been there, it's a really cool, fun little mining town that has just a lot of really neat, it's a great jumping off point if you want to go to Sedona or the Grand Canyon. But it's also just got a lot of history, a lot of character, a lot of really fun restaurants and shops. It has an old jail that's actually sliding down the side of the mountain that you can go visit. A lot of fun. When the mine closed down decades ago, the town has sustained itself on tourism. That's how the town exists, is because people come to visit. But the town is known as a vertical city because, in fact, they call themselves America's most vertical city because every single street goes up the mountain. It is very, very steep, and there is not a lot of room to put hotels or lodging or things like that. So there are a couple of hotels there, but then there are just a lot of homes. There are a lot of vacant homes because, again, there aren't a whole lot of jobs in Jerome anymore these days unless you're serving the tourism industry. Glenn Odegaard went up from Phoenix to visit Jerome, and he just fell in love. He just loved it. It was such a cute town. He really wanted to have a place where he could just go on the weekends. He thought it would be neat if he could escape the Phoenix heat and go up to Jerome sometimes in the summer. But, you know, Glenn is a working man, and he could barely afford one home in Phoenix, much less a second home up in Jerome, but it's expensive to go up and stay in a hotel all the time. So he looked around, he kind of kept his eyes open, and one day he found Home Sweet Home. And Home Sweet Home for Glenn was a little bit different than Home Sweet Home would probably be for most of us, because Home Sweet Home was a house that had sat vacant for half a century. It had been the victim of a mudslide. So in Arizona, it never rains except for when it does, and then everything just falls, right? Probably similar here. It was the victim of a mudslide. There were boulders inside the cars sitting inside the house, and a tree was actually growing out of it. It had sat like that for half of a century, but for Glenn, because he knew that if he purchased that home and he had the right to do with it what he wished, he saw an opportunity. He was a bit of an entrepreneur. He said, you know, this house is not going to be expensive. If I buy this house and I fix it up, then I can rent it out to overnight guests, people who want to come visit Jerome who don't have a place to stay during the week, and then I can use it on the weekends when I want to come up, and I can use the money that I make from the renters to pay back for my expenses and all the things I need to do to fix up the home. He was incentivized to fix that home because of private property rights. A house that had sat vacant for half of a century was turned from literally a health hazard to a historic beauty that made its way onto the cover of Arizona Highways magazine. And even the Chamber of Commerce talked about how great it was. He restored it to its just historical glory. It was such a beautiful home. It was covered in newspapers. And then one day, some of the hotel operators got together and said, you know what? We don't really like that this guy's renting out his house. And actually, a few people kind of followed in his footsteps and started fixing up some of the older houses and renting them out. And the hotels didn't like that because now they had competition. And now they had people that, and they had cheaper options or maybe places where families could stay and cook their own meals or just things like that. And the hotel said, you know, we're going to go to the city council and talk to them about this home sharing thing. So they went, and the town council voted to outlaw short-term rentals. But they didn't just stop there. They didn't outlaw short-term rentals, they made it a crime punishable by jail time. Now, Glenn was kind of stuck. He had been very successfully renting out his home, no problems whatsoever, hadn't been accused of causing any problems, but he needed that income to be able to keep that house and to keep it in its beautiful state. And so he went to the city and he said, why is it that you can't work with me and I'm not causing any problems? Why are you just outlawing my business essentially and threatening to throw me in jail if I keep renting out my home? And the city said, well, here's why. And later on you'll realize why the city had to come up with these reasons. Because most of the time governments just say, why not, right? But in Arizona, I'll explain to you later why the city actually had to come up with some good reasons for why it's going to outlaw short-term rentals. And here's what the city came up with. Well, we have a lot of potholes in Jerome, which if you've been to Jerome, you know they do. They have a lot of potholes. If you are a visitor, you're not going to know where those potholes are. And if you're out driving or walking, you're going to fall and trip in the potholes and get hurt. And that's not good. We don't want that. So you can't have short-term rentals. Kid you not, you can look this up. It's in the official city records. And then they said, you know what? Visitors aren't going to know when garbage day is. If they're staying in a hotel, the hotel will take care of the garbage. But if they're visiting and staying in a short-term rental, they don't know when garbage day is. They could put garbage out on the wrong day. We could have javelinas coming out and tearing apart the garbage. It's just going to be a total wreck. We can't have short-term rentals. And the final one, I kid you not, is they said, we need enough long-term housing in the city so that the government officials have somewhere nice to live. And your house is really nice. And it would be better if we use that for city council members, because otherwise we're not going to be able to attract people to come serve in the city government. Did you not? You can't make this stuff up. Well, I'm happy to say that in the state of Arizona, none of that flies. And that law was actually wiped off the books, and Glenn was able to keep renting his home. By the way, it is still a beautiful home, It's still bringing a lot of people up to the town of Jerome, and he still has yet to have a complaint or a problem from the city or anybody else. We'll get into why that is a little bit later. Unfortunately, Glenn's happy ending is not shared across the country because cities across the country are rushing to regulate and outlaw short-term rentals. And it's really odd if you think about it because it's not a new thing. Everybody thinks about, you can take your phone, you can download these apps for Airbnb or HomeAway and rent homes that way. But short-term rentals or home sharing is a centuries-old practice. This is what people used to do back at the founding times of our country, allowing people to stay in your house overnight for, in exchange for money or maybe chores or some food. That is a very, very old and common practice. And in fact, it is a practice that helped get around some of the very poor decisions that some hotels and other established businesses were making, especially in the Deep South, when hotels were denying the right of Black people to stay in hotels as they were traveling through the country. People opened up their homes as short-term rentals and allowed them to come through. So short-term rentals have a very, very, very solid history in the United States, and yet no good deed goes unpunished because once somebody creates, an app to facilitate the exchange of somebody's home in exchange for a guest who might be looking for a place to stay, which I would argue actually makes people more accountable in many ways because we know a lot more about the guests that are staying and we know a lot more about the property they're renting. Suddenly now the government wants to ban it. Now, they're not just banning short-term rentals, they are turning them into crimes, just like they did in Jerome. And they're not just stopping there. Because see, it's actually really hard to enforce laws against private property that don't go to some sort of health or safety objective or aren't trying to solve some sort of health or safety problem. See, if the problem was, hey, short-term rentals are causing too much noise, or there's a lot of trash, or people are parking in the wrong place, or there's too many of them, or there's too many people. There's so many different things that you can do to address those problems. But the way cities think about dealing with private property rights and regulating private property rights is they use the sledgehammer approach instead of the scalpel approach. And so it's actually really hard to enforce laws like that because if somebody isn't causing a problem, it's really hard to tell whether they're renting their home for 3 days or 3 months or whether it's a long-term owner in the house, right? You don't know. And so cities have to kind of figure out creative ways to enforce these laws. So one thing that they're doing is putting crushing fines on violators to kind of scare them away from violating the law. The city of Miami Beach, Florida is my favorite. You can be fined up to $100,000 per day for renting out your home. Goldwater Institute is actually in court arguing that that's an excessive fine. The Constitution of both the United States and the Florida Constitution both prohibit excessive fines. The punishment's kind of got to fit the crime, essentially. And if $100,000 for just peacefully renting out your house and not doing anything else is not excessive, I don't know what is. That's about half the value of the home that our client is renting out. So if she rents her home for 3 nights, basically there's a lien on her house and she's still going to owe the government money. There are other rights that are affected when government puts such draconian limitations on how we can use our property. Privacy rights, for example, again, it's hard to enforce these laws if we don't know whether people are renting or not because they're not causing problems. So in Hawaii, Honolulu County, which is actually the entire island of Oahu, they've actually hired a staff of 5, which is big for Honolulu, a staff of 5 people to go out and interrogate people on beaches and tourists and ask them where they're staying. Are you staying in a hotel or are you staying in a house? If you're staying in a house, is it your family's house or are you renting that house? And to knock on people's doors and to climb over their fences and to try to, peer in their windows and figure out if people are illegally renting their homes. In Chicago, another place where the Goldwater Institute has a lawsuit, the city allows you to rent your homes with many, many, many restrictions, including that you have to sign a document giving the government permission to come into your house at any time and for any reason without a warrant to be able to rent your house. Now, a guest doesn't have to be present. There doesn't have to be any kind of problem. They can just come in anytime, and who knows what they're going to do once they come into your house, right? That's another lawsuit that we're bringing. It's unbelievable. That clearly violates the right to privacy. Also in Chicago, they're taxing short-term rentals at 8% higher than they tax hotels or any other kind of rental. clearly a violation of equal protection. And also in Chicago, or in Illinois, the state constitution requires taxes to be applied uniformly. And there, the city just says, no, we're going to tax short-term rentals higher. When you ask the city why, and we did this in court, they say, well, we think short-term rentals hurt the hotel industry. They just said it. They just admitted it. They said, well, a tax will make it harder for short-term rentals to compete with the hotels. And the crazy thing about Chicago is that the judge was nodding when they argued that. In fact, when my colleague and I tried to say, well, that may be true, but it's not a legitimate function of government to tell people how to use their property so that they can keep competition away, the judge laughed, actually laughed. So, again, sometimes it feels good to be back in Arizona where judges at least take those arguments a little bit more seriously. And then, of course, there's Naples, Florida, which has actually outlawed advertisement of all short-term rentals. Now, there are some areas where short-term rentals are illegal in Naples, and there are some areas where they've put restrictions where they say, well, you can only rent your home for a certain amount of time per year. So in order to enforce that, they say, well, you know, we really find out if people are renting their homes by going online and going through Airbnb and going through HomeAway and figuring out where people are offering rentals, and then we go bust them. And if you list your home for rent, we don't really know if you're actually renting that home for longer than the cutoff time or shorter than the cutoff time, whatever. So we're just going to ban all rentals or all advertisements altogether, which of course makes it really, really hard to offer your home for rent if you can't advertise it online. That is a violation, we argue, of the First Amendment and the state constitution, which guarantees your right to free speech. If you're exchanging legal, truthful information with people, that is a free speech right. So why do I go through all these examples, and why am I so focused on short-term rentals? It's because it's a great modern illustration of how violating private property rights necessarily violates a whole host of other constitutional rights. And why is that? That's because rather than recognizing that we have private property rights and starting there and then determining whether we have enough problems to actually scale back a little bit on those rights and put reasonable regulations into place, government these days just starts with the idea that you don't have a right to private property, and we can regulate however we want, regardless of whether or not there is a demonstrable health, safety, or welfare problem. Now, this is totally different, of course, from how our founders saw private property rights. Our founders thought that private property rights were fundamental human rights. In fact, they argued that private property rights were essentially the cornerstone of liberty, and that's why we name our book that way. You cannot have any of your other property rights, or any of your other constitutional rights, I would argue, if you can't have property rights. Imagine, how would you exercise your Second Amendment rights if you couldn't own a gun? How would you exercise your free speech rights if you aren't allowed to own, say, a printing press or a computer nowadays, right? You would not be able to exercise free speech rights. How about your right to free exercise of religion? If you can't own your church and the government can come in and take away your place of worship because they don't like what you're saying, well, then you really can't exercise those rights. And on and on and on. And the short-term rental example is a great example of that, because when you start to erode away at property rights, when you start to undermine property rights, you necessarily affect all these other constitutional rights that governments at least still pay lip service to these days. And that's why property rights are so important, and that is why our founding fathers put property rights in the Constitution more than any other right? The Constitution protects our right to our homes, it protects our right to our things. Very, very important to the founders. Because if we can't be free to own our property and use our property as we see fit, so long as we're not harming anyone else, then we can't be free at all. But in the 20th century, as progressivism kind of took hold, that philosophy shifted. And property rights were no longer seen as a good in and of themselves, as something that people inherently had as a natural right. Instead, property rights were looked upon as something that was only respected insofar as it's good for society, right? And that's generally how progressives see things anyway. They look at group rights and they look at what's good for society. Same with the right to free speech. You know, there's a lot of people on the left, a lot of big government progressives that claim that they value free speech and they respect the First Amendment, but they don't look at it the same way that limited government, free market folks look at it. Because we would argue, again, that free speech is a right that you have inherently. It is a constitutional, natural right, and it is good in itself. It is good for you to be able to express yourself. It's an individual right. And see, the progressive vision of that is, well, no, free speech is good for society. It is good because usually good ideas or even bad ideas can be combated with good ideas, and it's good for society to learn information. But the second that it's not good for society, the second that somebody says something that isn't good for society, then we no longer have a right to free speech. It's no longer valuable. Now, who makes those decisions? Who decides whether or not private property rights are being used in a way that's good for society, or free speech rights are being used in a way that's good for society? Well, the government makes that decision, right? It has to. And of course, that is extremely dangerous. That's exactly the type of thing that our founding fathers were afraid of. That's why we have a constitution, because we do not live in a democracy. There are a lot of things that we decide collectively through the ballot process, but we live in a constitutional republic, and there are some rights that are so precious and so sacred that we don't get to put them up to a vote, right? They're just protected. That's what our country's all about, but that's not the progressive vision for our country, and that is what's destroyed private property rights. And unfortunately, and this is why the Federalist Society is so important, unfortunately, that progressive theory has worked its way into our courts and our law schools. I'm sure a lot of you who have gone to law school have similar experiences. When I went to law school, and I actually had a pretty good law school experience at Michigan State, but when I went there, I took constitutional law. In fact, I took all the constitutional law I could get my hands on, because I had already been working in public policy, and I knew I wanted to do this kind of work, and so I took every constitutional law class I could get. And you know what? Not once in any of those common law classes did I ever get a constitution handed to me and get asked to read the document. I kid you not once. No, what they wanted to teach us about is, what did the courts say about the Constitution, or what do legal scholars say about the Constitution? All very relevant and important, but one would think that consulting the actual document would be something that a lawyer would want to do. Nevertheless, we did not. Now, at Hillsdale College, my undergraduate institution, it doesn't matter what your major is. You could be a science major, you could be a business major. They make you take a course on the Constitution because they know it's important for every American to read and understand it. By the way, it's not that long. It's really not, right? My goodness, it's a bedtime story. You can read it. But now, if you're talking about state constitutions, especially the Western states, I mean, if you want to read the California Constitution, that's like War and Peace, right? That's going to take you some time. But the federal Constitution, it was written for people who can understand. It's written for all of us, right? To read and understand and know and love and follow. And today in law schools, and today, unfortunately, with some very notable exceptions, it's not happening in law schools, and it's not happening on the bench. And so, decades of bad court decisions throughout the 20th century have eroded away at our property rights. And of course, this culminated with the Kelo versus New London decision. Get ready to be depressed, because this is a Supreme Court decision, right? Our friends at the Institute for Justice brought this case. They brought it all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and there, the United States Supreme Court, in a very divided decision, rubber-stamped the ability of a state government, the state of Connecticut, to come in and take away private property from private property owners and give it away to redevelopment projects for big businesses. Now, how the heck did they do that? Well, the Constitution, of course, gives the government the eminent domain power, and the eminent domain power is pretty clear. It says that the government can take private property for what? Public use. So we can think about, what is a public use? A public use is maybe a road or a post office, or maybe even a park. And some of these things get further and further away from what I think government should use private property for, but these are all at least public things. There is one thing that public use doesn't mean. What is that? Private use. Private use, exactly. And so it seemed pretty obvious when the state said, well, hey, we want to come into this lower middle class neighborhood where the people aren't exactly the type of people that we want around here, and we want to basically plow out all these houses in the Fort Trumbull neighborhood and make it available to a big company like Pfizer, because we think it would be really great if Pfizer came in and we could build fancy offices and really nice restaurants and upscale shopping, and that would just be a nicer use of this property. Exactly. That's why they did it, right? So when the court looked at this, and when the Institute for Justice argued this is a private use, the court said, no, no, no. It's a public use because the public purpose is that this creates more tax revenue and it creates jobs. By the way, don't ever use that phrase, creates jobs. If your kids ever use it, wash their mouth out with soap, right? Government can't create jobs. Government can redistribute wealth. Government can take money from Peter and give it to Paul. Government cannot create jobs. Businesses and the market can create jobs. Government cannot do that.
So where was the swing vote from?
Yeah.
What state was she born in?
Yeah. I think you all know the answer to that one. Unfortunately, Arizona hasn't always turned out the best judges, although we have some great ones now. You're referring to Justice O'Connor, and you know, Justice O'Connor, although she was a Republican appointee and she's written some good decisions, was very unfortunate in some of these cases. There were some really serious dissents in the Kelo case. Justice Thomas noted in particular the effect that a decision like Kelo would have on minority people, would have on low-income people, because essentially that's what the government was saying is, look, or that's what the court was saying, is that the government finds you undesirable and would like to have other people in a neighborhood, they can go ahead and take your property and give it to somebody else. And you know, that is extremely dangerous, right? Zoning laws, believe it or not, and some of you may know this, actually started out of that same kind of premise, right? Back when zoning laws were put into place, and we think now of zoning laws, you know, keeping our neighbors quiet at reasonable times and that kind of thing. But zoning laws were essentially, when they were put into place in the South, they were essentially put into place to keep certain undesirable people out of neighborhoods. It's a very dangerous power to give to government, and we should be very concerned about that. Nevertheless, that's what the Kelo decision did. Here's the silver lining of the Kelo decision. People from all over, from both sides of the political spectrum and all over the country stood up and said, you know what? We are not going to take this anymore, because now we realize that private property rights actually aren't just tools for the wealthy and the well-connected. They're especially important to everyday Americans, because the wealthy and the well-connected have enough money and power to be able to pay people or to go to the government and pay them to keep their rights protected or to take people's rights away, which happens a lot in eminent domain context. So it was the everyday Americans that really understood how important their property rights were. And so there was this wonderful movement across the country, again, led by our friends at the Institute for Justice and a lot of other groups at the State Policy Network, to go and put state protections in their constitutions or in their, through their state legislatures, to say, you know what, public use actually means public use, and you cannot take private property from one private individual and give it to another or give it to a business. Now, that was really great. Almost every state did that. Notably, the state of Connecticut did not. It has done nothing, and in fact, in the state of Connecticut today, it would be just as legal to do what they did to Suzette Kelo and her neighbors today as it was 14 years ago. So I guess some people never learn. But a lot of states did amend their laws for the good. Now, there are two really glaring, yes?
Out of curiosity, after they took Suzette Kelo's home,
Yes.
did Pfizer end up, well, state of Connecticut did that, but did Pfizer end up actually
Great
creating the
question.
factory?
Great question, Rebecca. If you go on Google Maps, have you ever used Google Earth where you can kind of look down the streets? If you go on Google Earth and you look at the Fort Trumbull neighborhood today, you will not see a Pfizer offices or anything like that. What you will see is basically a wasteland, because they took all the houses, they took all the property, they knocked them all down, and then Pfizer decided, you know what, it didn't make any sense for us to be here in the first place. And even with all of these government handouts, because it wasn't just property, but the government's going to give them a bunch of taxpayer dollars too. Even with all these government handouts, it still doesn't make economic sense for us to be in this neighborhood, and they decided not to come. And now there is nothing. Suzette Kelo's home actually was saved, not in its original location. It was knocked down, but it's actually a museum. It was moved not too far away from its original location. And if you're ever in New London, Connecticut, I highly recommend you visit it. It's a nice little museum. It's sad, but it also kind of explains what's been done since to protect people's property rights. So that shows you exactly what happens when you give government the opportunity to make these decisions about private property rights, right? Even the best of intentions, and there were not the best of intentions in New London, Connecticut, but even the best of intentions, they just can't centrally plan those things. So we have these reforms, and although we should celebrate those, there are two glaring problems left. And I want to just discuss those briefly because these are problems that I think in some ways are even worse than eminent domain. The first is the blight exception to eminent domain. Most states now have some sort of protection that says that you can't take private property away from one person and give it to another private actor. But most states also have an exception for blight, right? So they say, well, if the property is blighted, then government can come in and take it away, and then they could give it away or sell it for redevelopment projects. Now, when we think about blight, and you can all have a picture in your head, right? We think about houses that are falling down. We think about Glenn Odegaard's house that I told you at the beginning, right before he fixed it up, something that's really dangerous and detrimental to health and safety. So it kind of makes sense that government could take property for that purpose, right? But most states don't define blight, or they define it in very vague terms, which means that blight is in the eye of the beholder, and of course that's the bureaucrat. So in California, many cities have tests that they call the windshield test, and basically it means that a bureaucrat drives through your neighborhood and looks out his windshield and determines whether or not that property is blighted or not, and writes it down on a piece of paper and takes it back, and then the government gets to do with it what it will. Among the many factors that California cities or other government entities in California can consider when determining if property is blighted are not just physical attributes, but also economic factors, which again is pretty insidious and sounds a lot like the Kelo case. So very, very problematic. In the city of Lakewood, Ohio, that city actually blighted a bunch of really beautiful middle-class homes and turned them into high-rise, fancy condos because they said, well, these properties are blighted because they don't have two-car garages and they don't have central air conditioning, and that makes them blighted. Now, I grew up in the Midwest without central air conditioning. It wasn't fun in the summertime, but I wouldn't consider my house blighted. Very, very problematic. And so the exception, the blight exception is one that people ought to be really concerned about. Not many states have actually eliminated their blight exceptions. Thank you. Arizona, I'm proud to say, is actually one of the states that has. In Arizona, there are very specific health and safety factors that the government has to go through and decide before it can blight a property, and the government bears the burden of proving it. Yes?
In the case of blights, can a citizen make a complaint against another citizen in order to jumpstart a blight process or something like that?
That does happen sometimes.
It's like
yes.
red flag law, but for
Yep.
property.
Yes. No, you know, we laugh, but that does happen a lot, and that's a good point to make, because laws that do not protect, or systems that don't protect private property rights, not only give government a lot of power, but they turn neighbor against neighbor, right? Yeah.
Can we go drive by Mayor Keller's house? We're not partisan.
Yeah.
Not partisan.
Yes, so very, very dangerous. Now, another, and I would say this is probably the worst exception to these post-Kelo reforms, is something called regulatory takings, which sounds really boring and sounds, kind of esoteric. I would argue that it is actually worse than eminent domain. It is more common than eminent domain, and it is hidden, so it's very, very hard to tell exactly what the government is doing to private property rights. So a regulatory taking is when government comes in and places a regulation on your property and tells you you can't use it, or you can't sell it, or you can't rent it out. There's something that you can't do with your property. But the catch is, even though the Constitution says the government can't take private property unless it's for public use and they pay you for it, right, just compensation, the problem is that most regulatory takings in courts' minds don't rise to the level of an actual compensable taking. What the court will say is, well, unless the government completely takes title to your property, you are out of luck. And so what you have is a situation where you buy property, then you have rights taken away from you. Now your property is worth less, but you're still stuck with the mortgage, you're still stuck with the taxes, you're still stuck with the liability in case somebody slips and falls or whatever else, and you don't get any money back from the government. A really, really good example of this, a really crazy example of this, came from Arizona. Now, this was actually a precursor to us reforming our laws. And you can find examples like this in every state across the country. There's a couple named Kent and Judith Wonders in Arizona, and they purchased a you're in New Mexico, so you understand when I describe like kind of a desert wasteland, like, just a really empty, nothing area on the outskirts of town, and they wanted to develop it. And they were going to turn it into a subdivision, and they got all the necessary permits, and they did everything they were supposed to do, and then the government said, okay, but before we actually give you final approval to do this, let's talk about your set-aside requirements. And they were like, okay, what set-aside requirements? Well, we want you to set aside 45 acres for native plant preservation. Now, the desert in Arizona looks a lot like the desert in New Mexico. We don't have a lot of like pretty native plants. And there were some tumbleweeds in the area, there weren't even any saguaro cactuses, which are actually protected species in the state of Arizona, but weren't any of those. 45 acres was 30% of the property, of the Wonders property, 30%. For nothing. They weren't even allowed to plant pretty plants in that area because those aren't native plants. Most anything that actually grows in Arizona that looks nice is not native to the state of Arizona, and they weren't allowed to do anything with that. This is native plant preservation. So basically the Wonders were told that they just had to set 30% of their property aside and do nothing with it. Well, as you can imagine, that would significantly reduce the value, so they went to court. And the Court of Appeals said, no recovery for you. There has been no taking because you can still use. The government was so nice to you. It's going to let you still use 70% of your property. What are you complaining about the 30%? That's not a taking. Your property still has value. Go home. So, what can we do about this and what did we do in Arizona? Well, as you heard in the intro, we passed something called the Private Property Rights Protection Act. And then I realized that lawyers should never be able to name any kind of law because Private Property Rights Protection Act is the worst tongue twister ever. And when I have been talking about it for the past decade or so in front of groups, it's never fun to say. Nobody can ever remember it. So we've actually renamed it Property Ownership Fairness Act, much like courts often go back and rewrite the Constitution. We're going back and rewriting the name of this law and calling it Property Ownership Fairness Act. What does it do? It's really simple. It just says that government has to pay you when it takes away your property rights, regardless of whether or not it's by eminent domain and they're actually taking title, or it's just taking away a right to use your property in a certain way. Now, there is an exception for legitimate health and safety because it is a legitimate function of government to actually stop people from doing things that harm others, right? But it is a very narrow exception. And here's the kicker, here's the important part. Government has to prove that it is regulating in order to protect health and safety. Because the way that the courts currently work is that if you go to court to defend your property rights or to defend your right to earn a living, those are second-class rights in our country today. And you, as the person who is defending your rights, you have to prove that you should be able to exercise those rights as you see fit. You have to prove that you're not harming anybody. It's actually a logical impossibility to be able to do that. People still win those cases, but they shouldn't. No one should ever win a property rights case because it's impossible to be able to prove that you will never cause problem with your property, right? The presumption, as we talked about before, that our founders had in mind when they wrote the Constitution is that you should be presumed to be free to do what you will with your property as long as you're not harming someone, and the government wants to come in and take away that right, it better have a good reason for doing so. So that's what the Property Ownership Fairness Act requires. Now, when we passed it, all the cities are complaining, oh my gosh, we can't have this law, it's gonna be too expensive if we have to pay to regulate. It's gonna be too expensive. I debated a lawyer who made his living defending governments and eminent domain actions and things of the like, and he said this is gonna have a chilling effect on cities' ability to regulate. And I said, well, first of all, anything in Arizona that has a chilling effect is a good thing. But also, that is a feature, not a bug, right? That's a feature. It's good. You know, if a regulation is for legitimate health and safety, government doesn't have to pay. If a regulation is not, if it's more imposing an aesthetic preference, you know, like this 45-acre set-aside, well, then if that is really worth it, then the government and the community better be willing to pay for it, because it's not fair to force the property owner alone to shoulder the costs of those aesthetic preferences being imposed. So that is really the beauty of a law like the Property Ownership Fairness Act, and why I really encourage other states to take up these types of reforms, is that it changes the rules. It doesn't stop regulation, but it makes government think about the costs of regulation. And that's really the problem that, that we have across the country when it comes to property rights, is that government doesn't think about cost because they don't have to, because they don't think that property rights are real rights. And when they start thinking about property rights as real rights, and I wish we could just send them all a constitution and say, read the constitution and, do your job. Since we can't do that, or since they won't do that, we have to change the rules and we have to make them think about the costs of regulation. And if the regulation is worth it, then great, go ahead and regulate and pay up. If it's not, then it's probably not a good idea in the first place. And by internalizing those costs and making government think about the costs of regulation, we can, I believe, once again, restore private property rights to what our founders actually intended, restore the presumption of liberty, and restore them as the cornerstone of liberty. So hopefully that gave you a little something to think about. Thank you very much for listening to me blather on for 45 minutes, and I'd be happy to take any more questions.